Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on your time of day and part of the country that you're in or part of the world. My name's Claire Murray, and I'm here with Josh Pachter. Both of us are contributors to the book you see behind my left shoulder, Peace, Love, and Crime. Peace, Love, and Crime, crime fiction inspired by the songs of the 60s. Josh was the 2020 recipient of the Short Mystery Fiction Society's Golden Derringer Award for Lifetime Achievement. That's quite a big deal. That means he's been writing for quite a while and doing it well. Since 1968, his crime fiction has appeared in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine, Black Cat Mystery Magazine, Mystery Weekly, Mystery Tribune, and various MWA, PWA, Sisters in Crime, BoucherCon, Malice, Domestic, and Year's Best collections. Josh also edits anthologies such as The Great Filling Station Holiday Holdup, crime fiction inspired by the songs of Jimmy Buffett, and Only the Good Die Young, crime fiction inspired by the songs of Billy Joel, both of which will be published this spring, and translates fiction and nonfiction from multiple languages, mainly Dutch. In his day job, he teaches interpersonal communication and film appreciation at Northern Virginia Community College. Welcome, Josh. What
Hi,
would you like to
good to be
say to
with
our
you.
audience?
Well, it's pleasant to be here with you, Claire. I'm happy to talk with you and to talk with the people who access your blog, and we'll see this interview there about my contribution to Peace, Love, and Crime, about writing in general and anthology editing and translating, those various different subjects that I've been dealing with for a long, long time and that you mentioned in your introduction. Fire away, and I'll do my best to answer your questions.
All right. Well, and by the way, I've been noticing that the blog is getting a few more hits from people, not just other authors in the anthology, but now from some people who are followers of people like you and Michael Bracken and John Floyd, who have already been interviewed before you.
Well, that's great. I hope you get a lot of traffic.
Well, that would be fun. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of translation of others' stories. That's a quite a talent to have, and it's not the everyday thing that authors do. So how did that get started, and what's the most difficult part of that for you, or the greatest challenge of it?
A long time ago, I lived in Amsterdam for about 6 years. I was married to a Dutch woman at the time, and our circle of friends included some people who were in small press publishing in the Netherlands. One of them in particular, Har van Vulpen, owned a company that published Dutch language comic books. And he wanted to publish Dutch translations of comics with an X by some of the underground American comics writers and illustrators like R. Crumb and Gilbert Shelton. R. Crumb, probably the best known of them all, and then Gilbert Shelton, who did the fabulous Furry Freak Brothers and Fat Freddy's Cat. And he came to my then wife Lydia and I and asked if we could translate some of those comics into Dutch for him. So we did that, and it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed working on it. So it kind of gave me the taste for translation. And then not long after that, another Dutch friend who owned a larger publishing company, and he was the publisher for, not as well remembered today as he deserves to be, but Dutch crime writer Jan Willem van de Wetering, who created the Amsterdam Cops Grijpstra en de Gier, or Grijpstra en de Gier, if you say it with an American accent. His Dutch publisher asked me if I would be interested in translating some of his short stories from Dutch into English. They'd had a request from Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, who I had written for since the late 60s, as you mentioned. So this was now the early 80s, and I agreed and translated a couple of those short stories, which again was just an awful lot of fun. More fun for me to translate out of Dutch into my native language than it had been to translate from my native language into Dutch with the comic books. Anyway, so I did a couple of Jan Willem stories. One of them was a finalist for the Mystery Writers of America's Edgar Allan Poe Award in 1985 or 86. And then other things came up and I drifted away from translating and didn't do any more of it for almost 20 years. But in the early 2000s, Janet Hutchings, the editor of Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, decided to launch a new feature in every issue of the magazine called Passport to Crime, which would feature a translation of a short crime story that had been written in a language other than English into English for the magazine's readership. And she knew that I had done these young villain translations 20 some years earlier and approached me and asked me to locate and translate some stories by contemporary Dutch writers. So I did a couple of those. I would do probably one every other year for the first couple of years. And then after a while, she asked me if I could translate any languages other than Dutch. And I thought, well, Flemish is kind of Dutch-like. Maybe I could translate some Flemish stories. And I tracked down, thanks to the internet and Facebook, a couple of Flemish crime writers living in the Flemish-speaking section of Belgium, and did a few translations by Bafo Doge, Bob van Laarhoven, and a couple of other people. And so for about, I would say, 5 years, I was contributing anywhere from a third to a half of the translated stories that Janet was running, somewhere in that neighborhood. And she finally said, you know, it's too many Dutch and Flemish stories. Could I do any other languages than those? And I thought, well, I can try. So I started soliciting stories by authors who wrote in other languages, and using the help of Google Translate, was able to figure out what these people were writing. And because I'm a writer myself, I was able to translate into readable and hopefully effective English. So I've now had stories in EQMM that I translated from Dutch, Flemish, Spanish, Italian, Afrikaans, Chinese, and in the current issue that just came out a couple of days ago, Romanian. So I 7 languages now that I've done for Janet, and I'm in the market for some more. I'd like to see if I could hit the double digits. As far as the challenge goes, I think for me the biggest challenge of translation is to get out of the author's way. You know, there's a filter. That's what translation is. It's a filter between the original author and the reader. And I want the stories that I translate to be the story the author would have written if the author knew how to write in English. So that's always a challenge, and it's always the goal. And the biggest compliment that I get from the authors I translate, I'm happy to say that I get it fairly often, is when they, having read my translation, because even though they don't write in English, they can read English. Having read my translation, when they say to me, yes, this is the way I would have written it if I was writing in English, that's when I know that I've had the challenge.
That is wonderful. And that is such a talent to have. And they say it keeps your brain active too. The more languages you speak, the better your brain can handle other things in life, including aging. So,
well, I would love to be able to speak these various languages. I do speak Dutch. Dutch people think that I'm fluent in Dutch. I know better. I'm semi-fluent. I like to say that in the other languages, I'm fluid, by which I mean I can order a beer in a restaurant, but that's about as far as it goes.
Well, that's what's most important.
To keep your priorities straight.
That's right. That's right. So, you know, you mentioned some editors that you've worked with and got you into this translation stuff. How about some particular writers from your early years? Any that still resonate with you or inspire your stories today? And what comes to mind when you think about them?
Well, I started reading Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine when I was 15 years old. And during the first year that I was reading the magazine, I found a story by a guy named Richard Deming called Open File, which was a police procedural in which the cops at the end of the story had failed to solve the crime. And I thought in my 15-year-old wisdom that there was enough evidence in the story that the cops ought to have been able to solve the crime. So I sat down at my little tiny non-electric typewriter, and I typed up a new ending to the story, and I put it in an envelope, and I mailed it off to Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, never expecting that I would get any kind of a response. But a couple of weeks or a month later, I got in the mail a 2-page handwritten letter from Frederick Danae, who was half of the writing team of Ellery Queen. And Mr. Danae told me that he liked what I had done and that he had passed it on to Richard Deming. At the end of the letter, which I wish I still had, but I don't, but I can remember because it's just burned into my head, the last 2 sentences of Mr. Danae's letter. He wrote, "Have you ever considered writing a detective story yourself? Seems to me, Josh, if I may, you should." So here's me, 15 years old, and Ellery Queen is telling me to write a detective story. Obviously, I did.
That's a
And
wow.
I sent it off to him at his home address, which he encouraged me to do, and he bought it and published it in Ellery Queen. So I had, at the age of 16, I became the second youngest writer in the history of Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. There was one guy named James Yaffe, who wrote the Mom stories, who sold a piece to EQMM when he was 15, the bastard. So I'm the second youngest. But anyway, so as far as somebody who resonates with me today, I mean, it was Fred Danae whose graciousness and kindness and encouragement got me started in this business / hobby of writing crime fiction, which I've been pursuing for more than half a century now. There were almost immediately after I published that story in EQMM, because I was now allowed to, because I was a professionally published writer, I joined the Mystery Writers of America, which had monthly cocktail parties at the Hotel Seville in Manhattan. I grew up on Long Island, a railroad ride away from Manhattan. So I used to go into the city once a month and go to these cocktail parties. And there were 4 married couples, who basically adopted me and took me under their wings. In all 4 cases, as it happened, the men were the crime writers and the women were the crime readers. And that was Ed Hoke and his wife, Patricia, John Lutz and his wife, Barbara, Bill Britton and his wife, Ginny, and then Stanley Cohen and his wife, Marilyn. And those 8 people, those 4 couples, just were so gracious and kind to me. All 4 of the men, sadly, are now gone. John Lutz, the last to go, he just died a couple of months ago. But the women are still alive. I stay in touch with all 4 of them. And I think that everything I write, everything I've written for half a century, couldn't possibly have happened without their kindness and without the kindness of Fred Danae and EQMM editors, Eleanor Sullivan and the current editor, Janet Hutchings, Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine editors, Ernie Hutter and Kathleen Jordan, and the current editor, Linda Landrigan, other editors, colleagues who have been wonderful friends and mentors and partners in crime along the way of the last half century. Again, I think probably every word I write owes its history to the friendliness of people who I've dealt with over the years.
Well, you really have a wonderful background there, and it really, I find the crime writer community that I've experienced, and I'm not a member of Mystery Writers of America, but I have so many friends who are. But I am a member of several Sisters in Crime chapters, and they're so generous with not just their time, but their guidance and suggestions when you ask for them. They're not just out there, giving you unsolicited advice, but when you ask a question, they take it seriously and they answer it. And I find that,
when you think about it, I mean, we're all in competition with each other because there's a lot more being written than there is room, especially in the short story field, to have published. And so any story that I sell to a magazine means that many fewer pages for you, Claire, or for the other writers. It is competitive. And yet, despite the competitive element of it, I agree with you. I think the community, the members of the community are just gracious and friendly and willing to give advice. And They will root you on, even when the successful result of them rooting you on is that you're occupying page space. Otherwise, maybe they would have for themselves. But I don't see it. I've never seen any evidence of jealousy. I've only ever seen pride and joy
Yep.
amongst the members of the community in each other's success. And I've been part of other communities that didn't have that attitude. Part of the reason that I remain a member of this one is because it does.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really important. Um, so because you're a short story writer and you've been doing this now for what, 50 plus years, you you don't have one favorite, but you have some favorites. And as you mentioned in the questions I asked you ahead of time, um, you didn't want to give me one because you didn't want to get in trouble with the family. So why don't you tell me about that? Some of the stories that are closest to you, your heart.
Well, I will mention the two that I wrote about in my written answers to your questions, but let me say that there are others as well that are very important to me. The first story that I sold to friend N.A. Was an important story. It appeared in 1968. Exactly 50 years later, I wrote a sequel to it that I called 50, that Janet Hutchins published in the November-December 2018 issue of the magazine. It wound up finishing second in the EQMM Annual Reader's Choice Awards. That's the cover from that issue, is what you see behind me there, hanging up on my wall. That's a special story. But the two that I think are the most special are the two that I wrote to you about. And they are two collaborative stories. One that I wrote in 2009 with my daughter, Rebecca Jones. We did a story together called History on the Bedroom Wall, which is a line from a song that she likes an awful lot by Ani DeFranco. And that story is set at Middlebury College, where my daughter was a student at the time.
Vermont, right?
And actually, my character from my first story and my 50th anniversary story makes a cameo appearance in Becca's and my joint story. He turns out to be one of the teachers at Middlebury College in our fictional version of the college. So we sent that story into Janet Hutchins. She accepted it. She published it in EQMM in September, October, I think it was 2009. Interestingly, she included that story in the magazine's Department of First Stories, which is just a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for people who are looking to break into short crime fiction publication. Every issue of the magazine, Janet publishes nowadays 2 stories by people who have not previously been paid for professional fiction. And so she put Becca's and my story in that part of the magazine, which makes me not only the second youngest writer in the history of EQMM, but it also makes me the only person who has ever appeared in the Department of First Stories twice, because that's where Fred put my original story in 1968. So I was in the Department of First Stories in 1968, and then again 41 years later in 2009. So that's definitely a high point for me. It's a collaboration with my kid. And then the other one that I mentioned in my written responses is a story called Coffee Date, which I co-wrote with my second and current and best wife, Lori Pachter. She and I met on Match.com. And Lori's a writer for the government. She writes nonfiction, writes and edits nonfiction for a federal agency. But she's always been an avid crime fiction reader and always wanted to do some writing. So we wrote a story together. Mostly I plotted it, mostly she wrote it. And it appeared in the Saturday Evening Post in 2015. It's about a couple who meet for the first time on a coffee date, which is exactly how we met, except when we met, there was no murder. So that was also a high point to get the opportunity to write a story, not just with my daughter, but also to get to write one with my wife and to see both of them appear in print.
Great. It's always interesting to see a little more behind the writer of the story and not just visualize someone sitting there pecking away at the keyboard, but someone who's got an active life outside of that. And so let me ask now, what's next for you? You have a story coming out this week. In another.
Actually, two, I suppose. I have in the current March-April 2021 issue of Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, I have a story called The City of Light, which is set in Paris on the day of the Notre Dame fire, which was actually 2 years ago, so the bright vanish. And then I also have in that same issue of a translation of a story by a Romanian author, Bogdan Hrib. That story is called A Bucharest Arrest. So I have a story in the translation in the new Ellery Queens, and then I do have coming out on February the 22nd, my newest anthology project. It's The Great Filling Station Holdup, crime fiction inspired by the songs of Jimmy Buffett. And that's a follow-up to a book I did last year for Untreed Reads, the same folks who did Peace, Love, and Crime. Last year's book was The Beat of Black Wings, crime fiction inspired by the songs of Joni Mitchell. And I wrote the title story in that volume. And so when I decided to do a Buffett book, I thought, well, I should also write the title story in the Buffett book. So I have a story called The Great Filling Station Holdup. And that'll be out on February 22nd. And then I've got another anthology coming out in April, also this one from Untreed Reads. The Buffett book's coming out from Down and Out Books, but from Untreed Reads, I have Only the Good Die Young, crime fiction inspired by the songs of Billy Joel, and I did write Only the Good Die Young for that book. But it's not just that I'm buying my own stories, I've also got some other people buying them too. A new story coming out sometime this year in Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine. I have a story in an anthology called Murder by the Glass, which Untreed Reads will be publishing in June of this year. That book is all about stories that have something to do with alcoholic beverages. It was edited by Teresa Ng and Heather Widener. And then a few other things coming out in some other places as well. I got asked recently to do an anthology for an Inspired by Music, a book that I'm not editing myself, being edited by Art Taylor, and it's crime fiction inspired by the songs of Warren Zevon. So I have a story in that book. I haven't been writing a lot lately. That may seem weird given that I've got a bunch of stuff coming out, but the stuff that's coming out is mostly stuff I wrote before the pandemic, which is just now working into print. But I know that some people, given the pandemic, have been writing more than ever. I have not. As a teacher at a community college, all my classes are online thanks to COVID. And I find that it takes me more time to do the online teaching than it takes me to do the face-to-face teaching. So I just haven't, and plus with the anthologies I'm editing, I haven't had a lot of time to devote to writing. But I'll get back to it. You know, eventually I will. And I've got a whole file of titles for stories I want to write, so I know I've got enough ideas to keep me going probably for the rest of my time on the planet. So you know, keep looking. I'm sure you'll keep finding stuff as the years roll on.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Is there anything else you'd like to tell our audience beyond, you know, the questions I sent? They'll be posted with the blog, and as will the video. Anything else you'd like to say?
Well, I suppose your audience is comprised of a couple of different categories of people, Claire. To the people who are reading your blog and who will see this because they are crime fiction readers, buy a copy or 10 of Peace, Love, and Crime. It's a good volume. Sandy Murphy, the editor of that book, did a lovely job putting together some terrific fiction inspired by some terrific songs. And I also hope that people who see this interview will want to check out some of my books, Joni Mitchell, Jimmy Buffett, Billy Joel. They're fun books. I hope people will enjoy them. So to the readers, you know, keep reading and buy books. And then I suppose you also will have people who pay attention to your blog who are either established writers of crime fiction or wannabes. To the established writers, thank you so much for all the joy and entertainment and good reading you have given me over the years. And to the wannabes, don't just wanna be, go ahead and be. Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine scares people because it is, bar none, the longest standing and most respected crime fiction magazine in the world. Now, there are others that are very, very good, but they occupy a very special place, and that scares potential contributors off. Because of their Department of First Stories, though, they offer an opportunity that most other publications don't offer wannabe writers, and that is the chance to compete not with professionals, but with other people who are not yet professionally published for that very, very highly prized magazine space.
That's really
So
a good
start at the
point.
top and see what happens. Don't start at the bottom and work your way up, but set your sights high. Get your work into the hands of people who are in a position to pay you for it.
Great, thank you. Well, you've been very generous with your time and your thoughts. I appreciate it. I'm sure viewers and readers will appreciate it as well. And meanwhile, I wish you the best of the rest of the weekend. This is a Sunday, so we're closing down and coming into a new week. And for those who haven't, this is the first of a couple of video author interviews I'll be doing. Most of the authors are a little camera shy, so Josh is the first. I do have one or two others who've said, okay, I'll bite the bullet and do it. But I want to thank you, Josh, for being the first and taking the risk and putting yourself out there. Thank you
My
so
pleasure.
much.
Thanks for having me, Claire. It's been a
All
pleasure.
right.